The voicemail was only 11 seconds long, but it changed everything. "Hey, it's me. I know it's late. I just needed to hear your voice." There was a pause, a soft breath, the faint sound of traffic somewhere far away. "I'll call you tomorrow." Tomorrow never came. And here's the part that still haunts people years later. The phone had been ringing in her purse the entire time, silenced by accident, unanswered, unnoticed. Imagine realizing that the one moment you ignored, the one call you meant to return, became the last chance someone had to stay. Before we go any further, take a second and ask yourself honestly, if you saw a missed call like that, would you listen to the voicemail right away, or would you assume there was still time? Because this story isn't about tragedy alone. It's about how ordinary moments quietly decide outcomes we never see coming. 6 months before that voicemail, Emily Harper was living what most people would call a stable life. She was 43, divorced, working as a patient coordinator at a small medical office in Ohio, the kind of job where people trusted her voice even before they trusted the doctor. She had a daughter in college, a small rented townhouse that smelled faintly of lavender cleaner, and a routine so consistent she could follow it half asleep. Every morning started with coffee she reheated twice. Every evening ended with the same chair, the same lamp, the same news channel murmuring in the background. And yet, beneath that calm repetition, something was quietly shifting. Emily had started calling her younger brother, Daniel, more often than usual. Not long conversations, just quick check-ins. "You okay?" she'd ask. "Yeah, just tired," he'd reply. If you've ever brushed off concern because you didn't want to worry someone, you already understand how this begins. Daniel Harper was 38, recently laid off from a logistics company after what they called restructuring. No drama, no warning, just a box for his desk and a polite handshake. He told everyone he was fine, that he'd saved enough, that something better was coming. But the truth showed up in small details. He stopped going out with friends. He let dishes sit longer than usual. He slept with the television on because silence made his thoughts louder. He kept telling himself this was temporary, that real adults handled setbacks quietly. And maybe that's what makes this story so unsettling, because nothing about Daniel looked alarming from the outside. No public breakdown, no angry messages, no dramatic goodbye. Just a man slowly shrinking his life to fit the disappointment he didn't know how to name. Emily sensed it before she could explain it. She would pause after hanging up, holding her phone a second longer than necessary. "He sounded different," she once said to a coworker, then laughed it off. Different how? Tired. Flat. Careful with his words, like he was walking across thin ice. She wanted to ask more, but she didn't want to push. How many times have you done that? Felt something was wrong, but convinced yourself it wasn't your place to dig deeper? The human instinct to avoid discomfort can be powerful, especially when the people we love insist they're okay. Emily told herself Daniel was proud, that he just needed space. She promised herself she'd check in again soon, when she had more time, when things felt less heavy. 2 weeks before the voicemail, Daniel missed Emily's birthday. No call, no text, nothing. That was unusual enough to stand out. When she finally reached him later that night, he apologized quickly. "Lost track of the day," he said, forcing a light tone. Emily almost believed him. Almost. She wanted to say, "Talk to me. Really talk to me." Instead, she said, "It's fine. We'll celebrate later." After they hung up, she stared at the calendar on her kitchen wall, the red circle around her birthday still bright. That uneasy feeling settled in her chest again, heavier this time. Have you ever ignored a feeling like that, hoping it would fade on its own? The voicemail came 3 nights later, just after midnight. Emily had fallen asleep on the couch, her phone buried in her bag by the door. When she woke up for work the next morning, she rushed through her routine, grabbed her keys, and left without checking notifications. It wasn't until lunchtime that she noticed the missed call. One voicemail. She hesitated before pressing play, distracted by a coworker asking a question. "I'll listen later," she thought. Later became after work. After work became dinner. Dinner became exhaustion. That night, she plugged her phone in and went to bed without listening. If you're feeling uncomfortable right now, that's because this story doesn't hinge on cruelty or neglect, but on normal human delay, the kind we all participate in. The next morning, Emily received a call from an unfamiliar number. A police officer spoke calmly, professionally, using words that felt too formal for what they meant. Daniel had been found in his apartment. There was no sign of struggle, no note, just a quiet ending that raised more questions than answers. Emily listened, numb, her mind replaying every recent conversation, every time she'd said, "I'll call you back." At the station later that day, she finally listened to the voicemail. 11 seconds. That soft breath. That promise of tomorrow. She dropped the phone onto the table like it had burned her. If you were standing there, would you be able to breathe? Would you forgive yourself? The weeks that followed blurred together. Funeral arrangements. Condolences that sounded the same after the 10th repetition. People saying, he never seemed like the type. As if pain always announces itself clearly. Emily returned to Daniel's apartment to help sort his belongings. That's when she found the notebook. It was tucked into a kitchen drawer beneath old takeout menus. Inside were short entries, dates scribbled in the corner. Nothing dramatic. Just thoughts. Didn't hear back today. Applied for 3 jobs. Didn't want to bother Emily. One line stopped her cold. I keep telling myself tomorrow will feel different. How many times had she said the same thing to herself? Here's the turning point that still changes how people hear this story. At the back of the notebook was a folded page, written weeks earlier. Daniel had listed reasons to stay. His sister's laugh. His niece's graduation. The smell of rain on warm pavement. It wasn't despair that ended him, it was exhaustion. The slow belief that he was becoming a burden. That belief, unchallenged, settled in until it felt like truth. If you're listening right now, ask yourself honestly, have you ever felt like the people you love would be better off without your problems? A year later, Emily started volunteering at a local support line. She didn't do it to fix the past, she did it to interrupt someone else's silence. She learned how often people called just to hear another human breathe on the line. She learned how many of them apologized for taking up time. Every call reminded her of that missed voicemail, but it also reminded her that presence matters, even when words feel inadequate. I'm here, she'd say. Take your time. Sometimes, that was enough. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And then if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. And as you reflect on this story, ask yourself something important. Who in your life might be waiting for a call they're afraid to ask for? And if this story stirred something in you, imagine how it feels to be on the other side of that silence. Sometimes, staying isn't about having answers. Sometimes, it's about knowing someone would notice if you were gone. The party was already in motion when Arya Whitmore arrived, and that alone told you everything about where she stood in that family. Glasses clinked softly, laughter hovered just above polite, and a string quartet played something light and forgettable near the staircase. Arya moved through it all like a guest who had overstayed her welcome before she even said a word. She was 46, composed, carefully dressed in a navy blue dress she'd worn before to events where she was expected to smile and stay quiet. If anyone noticed her, they didn't show it. This wasn't her family's home. It belonged to her husband's parents, old money, old habits. The kind of place where people remembered how you embarrassed them longer than they remembered your name. Arya took a glass of water instead of wine, her fingers steady, her face unreadable. She had learned that composure was safer than honesty in rooms like this. What they didn't know was, this wasn't her lowest point. The moment came without ceremony, which somehow made it worse. Her mother-in-law approached with a thin smile, a manila envelope tucked casually under her arm like a dinner menu. No raised voices, no confrontation, just a quiet suggestion that they step aside, near the hallway where coats were hung. The papers slid out smoothly, already clipped, already signed on one side. We thought it would be easier this way, her mother-in-law said, voice gentle enough to sound kind. Arya didn't ask where her husband was. She already knew. He had chosen absence over accountability. Around them, the party continued, unaware or pretending to be. Arya felt the weight of the envelope settle into her hands, heavier than it should have been. What they didn't know was, this wasn't her lowest point. From that moment on, the room changed, even if no one said a word. Conversations dipped when she passed. Someone touched her arm a second too long and said, "You'll be okay," the way people say it when they're relieved it's not them. Another woman offered a tight smile, eyes already scanning the room for someone more pleasant to talk to. Arya could feel the judgment in the pauses, in the way people avoided asking questions they already thought they knew the answers to. She sat at the edge of a sofa and opened the envelope slowly, reading each page with care, as if precision could protect her dignity. When she signed, her hand didn't shake. That surprised even her. What they didn't know was, this wasn't her lowest point. She stood, placed the papers back into the envelope, and excused herself before dessert was served. No one stopped her. Outside, the night air was cool and smelled faintly of rain and cut grass. Arya walked to her car alone, heels clicking softly against the driveway. each step measured, controlled. She sat behind the wheel for a moment without turning the key, staring straight ahead, letting the silence settle. But the real loss that night wasn't the marriage. It was something quieter, something that slipped away without witnesses, something she wouldn't fully understand until much later. Long before that party, long before the envelope and the polite humiliation, Arya Whitmore had already been quietly disappearing. It didn't happen all at once. It never does. It began with reasonable choices, the kind people praise you for being mature enough to make. Arya had a career once, a steady role in corporate communications, nothing glamorous but solid, something she had built with patience. When her husband's opportunity came, the offer that required a move across state lines, it was framed as temporary. Just a few years, he'd said. Once I'm established, you can pick things back up. Arya believed him, or maybe she wanted to. She resigned, packed boxes, and told herself that love meant flexibility. What they didn't see was how easy it is to step aside when you trust someone else to hold the center. In the new city, Arya became efficient at being useful. She handled logistics, smoothed schedules, remembered birthdays, hosted dinners that helped his career move forward. When people asked what she did, she smiled and said, "I'm supporting him right now," as if that explained everything she had put on hold. Job applications went out slowly, then less often. Each rejection stung a little more than the last, until avoidance felt safer than hope. Her days filled with errands and obligations that left no trace. By the time his ambitions gained momentum, hers felt outdated. Like an old version of herself, she wasn't sure how to update. What they didn't know was, this wasn't her lowest point. The shifts in her friendships were subtle at first. Missed calls, group chats she stopped being included in, invitations that arrived late or not at all. Distance made it easy for people to forget, and Arya didn't fight to be remembered. She told herself everyone was busy, that adulthood naturally thinned relationships. But isolation has a way of making quiet conclusions feel like facts. When she needed money, she asked her husband, and each request chipped away at something she couldn't name yet. Independence became conditional. Choices became conversations she wasn't leading. Even her name started to blur, introduced less as Arya and more as his wife. She noticed it every time and swallowed the discomfort because pushing back felt unnecessary, even selfish. By the time the marriage began to fracture, Arya had already internalized the idea that she was replaceable, that her contributions were invisible by design. She moved through life efficiently, politely, as if taking up less space might prevent further loss. And yet, buried beneath years of compromise, something remained intact, waiting. Years later, one document would surface, and everything they believed would collapse. There was one part of Arya Whitmore's life that never quite fit the version of her people thought they knew, and it always surfaced in small, uncomfortable moments. Her father. He had passed away years earlier, quietly, without ceremony, leaving behind more questions than memories anyone was willing to explain. Growing up, Arya learned early that finances in her family were described with vague phrases. "It's complicated. It's being handled. Don't worry about it." There were arguments behind closed doors, relatives who stopped speaking for reasons no one clarified, documents discussed in hushed tones, and then locked away. As a child, Arya learned not to ask too much. As an adult, she carried that habit forward, mistaking silence for peace. What she didn't realize then was that complexity often hides leverage. Her husband knew just enough about her family history to be uneasy about it. Whenever Arya mentioned her father, even casually, his responses tightened. "That stuff is old," he'd say. "You don't need to get involved." When letters arrived with legal letterheads, he intercepted them first, assuring her it was routine, remnants of unresolved matters that lawyers were already managing. Arya let him. At the time, it felt like relief. Someone else taking responsibility. Someone else deciding what mattered. She had grown accustomed to letting decisions happen around her rather than through her. And so the silence continued, layered year after year, reinforced by trust and fatigue. But silence has different meanings depending on who controls it. Arya wasn't silent because she was unaware. She was silent because she had been trained to be. Taught that asking questions created tension, that attention brought consequences. What no one saw was how carefully she listened, how she remembered dates, names, and half-finished explanations. Even now, as the marriage dissolved and her identity thinned, those fragments stayed with her, waiting for context. Silence wasn't weakness. It was strategy, whether she knew it or not. After the divorce was finalized, Arya Whitmore moved into a small apartment on the edge of the city, the kind of place with thin walls and uneven floors that reminded you someone else had lived many lives there before you. Boxes lined the living room for weeks, not because she didn't know where things belonged, but because she wasn't sure what still belonged to her. Each box held evidence of a life that had slowly dissolved, framed photos she turned face down, books she didn't remember buying, kitchen tools chosen to please someone else's habits. There was no rage in her movements, no dramatic release, just a steady, aching grief, the kind that sits quietly in your chest and waits. At night, she lay on a mattress on the floor, listening to unfamiliar sounds from neighboring apartments, feeling the absence of a future she had once assumed was guaranteed. People expected bitterness. They offered it to her like a solution. "You should be angry," one acquaintance said, as if anger would make the loss easier to carry. Arya smiled politely and changed the subject. Anger felt like another commitment she didn't have the energy to maintain. Instead, she allowed herself to mourn what she'd given up without asking for repayment. Some mornings, the loneliness felt sharp enough to stop her mid-step, a reminder that independence often arrives without applause. But slowly, she began to fill the silence with something that belonged only to her. She started writing again, short reflections at first, then longer pieces she never planned to show anyone. Words helped her trace who she had been before she learned to shrink. One afternoon, sorting through old files, Arya found a contact she hadn't spoken to in years, a former mentor from her early career. The call was awkward at first, then warm, then unexpectedly grounding. They talked about work, about timing, about how life rarely moves in straight lines. When the call ended, Arya sat for a long time, staring at the blank wall, realizing something had shifted. She didn't chase revenge. She chose something far more dangerous: independence. The certified letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, slipped halfway under her apartment door like it didn't want to be noticed. Arya almost ignored it, assuming it was another notice she didn't have the energy to deal with. But the return address stopped her. A law firm she recognized only vaguely, a name her father had mentioned once, years ago, and never explained. She sat on the floor, back against the couch, and opened it slowly. Inside were documents dated decades earlier, papers she had technically inherited but never opened, never questioned, because she had been told they were irrelevant, complicated, already handled. The language was dense, careful, precise. Trust structures, beneficiaries, oversight clauses. Arya felt her breath change as she read, a quiet pressure building behind her ribs. This wasn't new money. It was old, planned, protected, hidden in plain sight while she learned how to live with less. As she turned the pages, the full shape of it emerged. Generational holdings spread across industries she'd never worked in but somehow owned. Assets managed quietly through layers of legal distance, designed to survive disputes, divorces, and curiosity. Accounts outside the country, regulated, legitimate, but deliberately invisible. And then there was the name. Not her father's, not her husband's. A corporate entity, she was listed as the sole controlling interest, something established the year she turned 21. Her hands rested on the papers, steady, stunned, as memory rearranged itself. The intercepted letters, the discomfort whenever she asked questions, the urgency to keep her uninvolved. None of it was accidental. And in that moment, the past rewrote itself. Arya didn't celebrate when the confirmations came in. She sat through meetings in small, quiet offices, listening as attorneys verified signatures, timelines, and structures that had existed long before she ever questioned her place in the world. Independent auditors reviewed records line by line, tracing ownership paths that looped through decades and jurisdictions, each conclusion delivered calmly, professionally, without drama. Every answer matched the last. Every detail aligned. Nothing about it felt sudden once it was explained. It felt deliberate, designed, as if someone, years ago, had anticipated exactly how fragile visibility could be. Arya asked practical questions, not emotional ones. She took notes. She listened more than she spoke. When it was over, no one congratulated her. There was no ceremony, just a quiet understanding that what she believed about herself had never been the full story. And yet, on the surface, nothing changed. Arya wore the same clothes, walked the same streets, returned to the same modest apartment each night. She didn't correct people when they underestimated her. She didn't announce anything to friends who had drifted or relatives who had stayed distant. The power didn't arrive as confidence or arrogance. It arrived as certainty. the kind that settles your posture without effort. Decisions felt clearer. Fear lost its edge. For the first time, she wasn't waiting for permission to exist fully. The world hadn't changed, but her position in it had. The first signs appeared quietly, the way most real shifts do. Her ex-husband's company began struggling with liquidity, the kind of strain that doesn't make headlines but keeps executives awake at night. Vendors wanted tighter terms. Credit lines shortened. Deals that once sailed through suddenly stalled at the final signature. Then, almost imperceptibly, relief arrived. A new investor stepped in, unnamed in conversations, represented only by legal counsel and firm language. Contracts were renegotiated. Timelines extended. Pressure eased. Inside boardrooms, people spoke in cautious optimism, grateful for the intervention without fully understanding it. No one connected it to Arya. Why would they? She had always been peripheral, the quiet presence at the edge of photographs, the woman who left early and asked for nothing. Months later, the filings became public, buried deep in documents few people ever read unless they had reason to be afraid. Ownership structures updated. Controlling interests clarified. And there it was. Her name. Not as a favor. Not as a footnote. As authority. Those who noticed felt the recognition hit in slow waves. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Memories rearranged themselves. The party. The envelope. The casual way her dignity had been handled. They remembered the Christmas party. Too late. When Arya walked into the charity gala that winter evening, she moved like someone who owned her space without announcing it. The same family who had once orchestrated whispers and polite glances at the Christmas party was there, dressed in familiar elegance. Yet the energy between them had shifted. She didn't arrive to confront, to reclaim, or to prove herself. She arrived quietly, carrying herself with an assurance that made the room adjust around her. Conversations paused subtly as she passed, eyes recognizing her presence but unsure how to engage. She smiled politely when greeted, offered soft nods in acknowledgement, and let the attention settle naturally, without demanding it. No one needed to ask why she was there. Her confidence made it clear. What they had once assumed about her invisibility no longer applied. Throughout the evening, the dynamic remained calm, almost surreal in its simplicity. Respect replaced pity in glances that once carried judgment. Silence replaced the hollow laughter that used to fill uncomfortable spaces. No arguments, no dramatics, no pointed remarks, just an unspoken acknowledgement that the rules had changed. Arya moved among the crowd, conversing when she wished, retreating when she chose, entirely unbothered by the past. The satisfaction wasn't loud. It didn't demand applause. It existed quietly in the recognition of her worth, in the balance of power restored without spectacle. She never asked for acknowledgement. She had already moved on. Alone in her apartment that night, Arya Whitmore allowed herself a rare moment of reflection. The boxes were unpacked, the papers organized, the phone silenced beside her. She thought about the years she had spent shrinking, accommodating, waiting for validation that never came. She realized strength had never needed to announce itself. Power didn't require a grand display, a confrontation, or dramatic vindication. It had grown quietly, patiently, shaped by observation, restraint, and an understanding that influence doesn't need an audience to exist. The world hadn't acknowledged her, and for a long time, that had felt like weakness. But now she saw it differently. Every silent decision, every moment she chose patience over reaction, had built the foundation she now stood upon. Sometimes the woman everyone underestimates is simply waiting for the moment she no longer needs permission. Arya hadn't sought revenge. She hadn't demanded recognition. She had only waited. And in that waiting, she became whole. As you listen to her story, consider your own life. Do you think dignity is louder than revenge? Tell us below. And if this story stayed with you, like it stayed with us, like, subscribe, and stay.